Good afternoon and welcome then to this afternoon's session, End-to-End SQL Server PowerPivot. My name is Peter Myers. Let's start with introductions. I'm a mentor and trainer with a company called SolidQ. We're an expert group of SQL Servers, consultants and trainers. I always like to point out that my background isn't in IT. I refused to study it at high school. Music seemed to be the way to go, but economics became my career, so I did a bachelor in business and worked for a shipping company, got involved as an analyst, having to analyze large volumes of data, container movements of commodities between ports, different dates. And so I had discovered that Access version 2 in those days was the tool that was really going to help me out. So with no IT background, I was able to teach myself what it was to build a model to store data and then allow it to query, or allow me to query it to answer the questions that I had within my role. From that, I discovered a natural curiosity around data. I liked the idea that I could be very creative in the way that I captured and stored data and then reported that to whoever needed it. And so about 14 years later, I find myself working with more than just Access these days. Typically SQL Server. I specialize in the business intelligence stack, so whether that's integration services, analysis, or reporting services, or the SharePoint layer on top. So all up, I think it's very interesting that my background started with business problems first, and I learned IT second. And I think that's a very valuable combination, or in that sequence anyway, when it comes to helping others solve their business problems, is understanding the business problem is really the starting point, and then how can I address that with information technology. You might detect that my accent isn't quite American. I am Australian. I have been living in San Francisco for the past 3 years. And I do include my email address here should there be any questions as follow-up. You're welcome to ask those questions, perhaps during the presentation, if not at the end of the session this afternoon. All right, so the session we have then is end-to-end PowerPivot. There's a complete story to tell here that I'll be telling in demonstration. It commences with describing what PowerPivot is. Please note that this is the current release of PowerPivot, SQL Server 2008 R2. If you're looking for what's new in the upcoming release, as we now know as SQL Server 2012, that would be another session this week. All right, but it's certainly a great starting point if you've never worked with PowerPivot before. So let me poll you as an audience to understand who is completely new to PowerPivot. And so at least 2/3 of the audience are raising their hands, and that's very much the fit that I was looking for. If you have had some experience with PowerPivot, I'm hoping that I could fill in some gaps for you with what you could achieve with both the Excel and the SharePoint add-ins. So the session outline then continues beyond the introduction to look at how we create PowerPivot workbooks, how we can create reports off our PowerPivot models, enriching with calculations, and then we switch across to the SharePoint story, whereby I can publish this workbook with an embedded model to a SharePoint library, and then we can go ahead and look at how the end user can configure data refresh, create new analytic experiences based off the workbook, and then how IT can monitor and supervise what's going on with the PowerPivot solutions that have been deployed. Finally, I did want to wrap up with what the next generation with SQL Server 12 is doing. So you've got an idea from what you see here today, what is going to be extended feature-wise in the next release. Okay, introducing SQL Server 2008 R2 PowerPivot. I really want to jump straight into demonstration. And the demonstration that I have is really just to launch Excel and to do things the old way. What did we do without PowerPivot? So you can note here, launching PowerPivot, that the Excel add-in for PowerPivot has been installed. Evidence of this is the fact that we have a PowerPivot ribbon. And I'll talk about PowerPivot in a minute, so let's just turn off about PowerPivot for the minute. And take a look here on the Data Ribbon tab that we have the ability to import data from external stores. So I'm going to bring some data in from SQL Server. And I have my machine connecting with my own credentials, and I switch across to the AdventureWorks DW database. And I have this view. There we go, Fact Internet Sales Demo. So when you import a view or a table using this approach, basically, it allows you to create a table in Excel that represents that tabular data. All right, so here we see in Sheet 1 a table. I'm going to Control-N to show you there are 600 and 2,980 rows, representing a fair chunk of our sales history. Where I go with this demonstration is simply to save this. Test. And we note that it takes some time to save. And the next thing I want to point out to you is that the native capabilities of Excel does allow us to go ahead and filter the data. So let's just take a look at the rows for a particular product, 214. And then we can go ahead and we can sort the values that we have here as well. Standard Excel capability, not even talking about PowerPivot just yet. But what I want to draw your attention to is the size of this workbook comes in at 21.6 megabytes. So just remember that number for now. What's the maximum number of rows we can include in a worksheet of our workbook? 1 million, a bunch. All right. The answer depends on what version of Excel. Of course, I'm here in Excel 2010, which means just over 1 million rows. So I'm going to end up in trouble at some point, aren't I? That over time, we'd expect that those volumes of sales data is going to grow beyond 1 million, and then what am I going to do? I'm probably going to be forced to aggregate it on the server and perhaps lose the granularity that I need for analysis in order to meet that constraint or avoid that constraint that Excel has. Okay, so just bear that number in mind. And I'm going to come back to the presentation. Let's now talk about PowerPivot. So PowerPivot's about empowering end users to create their own BI solutions using Excel 2010. It facilitates the sharing and collaboration of solutions, as we'll see in demonstration this afternoon, when using SharePoint Server 2010. And both capabilities are achieved through two add-ins, specifically the add-in for Excel and the add-in for SharePoint. Note that the Excel add-in is available for download from Microsoft at no additional cost. So providing that you already have Excel 2010, you're ready to go with PowerPivot simply by downloading and installing that add-in. Have a question already?
What about Excel 2007?
So the question is, Excel 2007, not supported. PowerPivot was released with SQL Server 2008 R2 in sync with Office 14, which we know is Office 2010. So what you're required to do if you have Excel 2007 and you wish to work with the PowerPivot add-in for Excel, you'll need to go ahead and upgrade to Excel 2010. All right, so a closer look at the Excel add-in. It's a client add-in that extends Excel 2010 to support creating data models. So traditionally, this has been the space of our IT professionals, right? When it comes to creating data models and deploying them and providing access to them, it's been those experts that produce cubes and so on. Now, it achieves this with a client-side version of analysis services. So it's interesting to note that PowerPivot is an analysis services product. It uses a new processing engine called the Vertipack engine, very different from MOLAP, ROLAP, HOLAP, if you're familiar with the story with cube storage. Okay, now essentially it's a column-based store. What it does is takes your data, optimizes and compresses it, and stores it. We're going to take a look at some statistics shortly about that. So this allows the modelers now, these self-service BI people, to efficiently load data volumes far greater than what Excel has been designed to do. Separate PowerPivot window is where all of the modeling work takes place. This window is available once the add-in has been installed. And this window then supports the importing, enriching, relating of data from different data stores, whether they're corporate stores, local, or ad hoc. So think of this particular challenge that in our corporate data warehouse, I have a good volume of sales data. And that's pretty helpful, but my marketing manager has asked me to compare or to produce a ratio of sales by state to the populations found in those states. We want a per capita ratio. Now, it's probably no surprise that we don't have population in our data warehouse. It's really the integration of corporate systems, and we don't manage or store population. But it just so happens that there's a government department that takes on board that responsibility, and that data is available through a data feed on the internet. Okay, so what challenge do I have then? Maybe receiving the sales data isn't a big challenge because I've already demonstrated that. Providing I have permission, I can import data into Excel and I can bring those rows in. What am I then going to do, however, to relate that to some data in a data feed? And this could be challenging even for our analysts and power users within the organization. So the first challenge, of course, is how are we going to retrieve that data from a data feed? And once we've got that in Excel, how are we going to relate the two sets of data together in a meaningful way? What function in Excel typically helps in that scenario? Yeah, VLOOKUP. So the vertical lookup function is pretty much used to look up a value in another range in Excel. So this is my test. When I'm out on a customer visit and I'm trying to interest them in PowerPivot, is I ask whether they're familiar with the VLOOKUP function. And anybody that works consistently with the VLOOKUP function is a primary candidate for upgrading and training with PowerPivot. Because as you'll discover through the demonstrations and theory in this session, this is what the forte of PowerPivot's about. But to do it with larger volumes of data and far more efficiently. All right, so what happens is, when you launch the PowerPivot window, it creates a new data connection that connects to an embedded data model that lives within the Excel workbook itself. The prerequisites for this capability, as already said, is Excel 2010, either 32 or 64-bit editions, Windows XP Service Pack 3 or above, and the Microsoft .NET Framework 3.5 SP1. Just be aware that when you download the add-in, you must download the 32 or 64-bit version that matches the installed version you have. All right, so 32-bit version of Office, you'll need 32-bit version of PowerPivot. Jumping ahead to talk about the second add-in. So my challenge is this now, that I've somehow managed to bring together these sets of data using PowerPivot and to produce a model that integrates the data in a way that is useful. And then people in my department have discovered that this model is useful for them as well. So, do I take that workbook, attach it to an email, and send it to them? Probably not a great idea, okay? We end up with version control issues, security issues about is that data leaving? What about the logic that's inside that workbook? Maybe I want to protect that from the users that are actually consuming the model data itself. So the SharePoint add-in effectively does this. It allows you then to publish the workbook to SharePoint, and then you can send the URL to the workbook via an email. And then consistently, all users, providing they have permission, can then go ahead and access that workbook. And what we'll discover in the demonstrations this afternoon is that URL really is a connection string. And then they can use this in entirely new analytic experiences to connect to and then create queries against. So essentially, that's the deployment mechanism. If you have the SharePoint add-in and you publish a workbook to SharePoint, that's deployment. Okay? Now, there's additional capabilities. End users can configure data refresh policies, so according to recurring schedules, let's go ahead and refresh the data so the data is current. And that finishes the story from the business user's perspective. Now, what was the project name for this product? Testing you here. Crescent? No. Gemini, right, from the Zodiac. And the Geminis represents the twins. So what we've talked about is one of the twins. The second twin, then, is the IT group. So do you think they'd like to know what you're doing here and what data sources you're accessing, what volumes of data you're accumulating, how many users and how often they're querying your model? Because that's precisely what this add-in has been designed to do. All right, so when they configure logging, it will capture statistics about who, when, server health statistics, data refresh failures, and it will then allow IT to keep an eye on what's going on. So when they discover that this model that brings together sales and population information is being heavily queried by many users, it might be of interest to IT to say, well, we'll take this on board as being a solution that we will then maintain. All right. Now, before this, they had no concept that this was going on. You know, using productivity tools like Excel and Access, there are numerous types of these solutions running around that IT simply don't know about. And maybe they want to know about from a government's perspective, or perhaps they just want to ensure it's being backed up. And it isn't because it's sitting on my C drive here on my laptop. Okay, so the concept there is that once it's published into SharePoint, of course, we'd expect that the content databases for SharePoint are being backed up, so that's looked after. But IT have now got information about who, what, when is going on with the data models that you publish. All right. So end-to-end, that's the story. From end users being empowered to go ahead and produce their own models with PowerPivot and Excel, and then the ability to publish those workbooks to SharePoint to then allow them to create new analytic experiences, to configure data refresh, and then for IT to monitor. So let's switch our focus immediately on to creating PowerPivot workbooks. First topic then is to introduce you to the PowerPivot window. So this is the interface that is used to load, explore, relate, and enrich data. It's launched from the PowerPivot tab that you'll find on the Excel ribbon. And there are numerous wizards and tools that support loading data from the clipboard, from databases and data feeds, also from local Excel workbook tables. Regardless of where your data is coming from, once it's loaded into the PowerPivot window, it's just tabular data. All right? Doesn't matter if it was sourced from Excel or from a relational database. And at that point, we can start to work and integrate the data by defining relationships. We can then extend and enrich the model definition with calculations. And then when we save our workbook, the PowerPivot metadata that describes the model and the data that you've loaded is then embedded inside the workbook itself. In fact, it is a backup of an analysis services database. That's what happens when you save a workbook that has an embedded PowerPivot model within it. So the first thing you're likely to do when you open the PowerPivot window is to go ahead and load some data in. The first and easiest approach is a copy and paste. So you can copy a range from within the Excel workbook or another workbook. I've even noticed, even though documentation doesn't say this, if you copy a table in a Word document, then you can then paste that to create a new table, or you can paste to an existing table and append or replace that data. More commonly, data is likely to come from your corporate systems. So we can load from databases, including all Microsoft database products. That's SQL Server Relational, analysis services we can use to load from cubes. Other PowerPivot workbooks that have been published to SharePoint could also be sources of data for your model. And then Access databases are also supported. Reporting services reports, interestingly enough, that you look at a report, let's just suggest that it's a report that is graphical representation or spatial representation of the data using a map. And you say, well, that data is really useful. I can see all of the states of the USA and I can see the populations spatially, but I need the data behind that. So providing that you have Reporting Services 2008 R2, which includes the new rendering format for delivering data feeds with the Atom renderer, you can use that to go ahead and retrieve and load data into your PowerPivot model. Other data feeds, whether it's intranet or internet, and then files like a CSV or an Excel file. The third approach, so copy and paste, external data, and then we have the fact that we can link an Excel table within the same workbook into your model. Each load results in a table loaded into your workbook. So let's switch across to demonstration. What was that magic number of the size of this workbook? 21.6. Okay, let's remember that. I'm going to close Excel. Don't save. I'm going to go ahead and launch Excel again. So we can see it loading the PowerPivot for Excel add-in here. That's the first evidence we have. And the second is that we have the PowerPivot ribbon tab here. First in line then is to launch the PowerPivot window. But before I do, let me go ahead and save this blank workbook simply as sales analysis to the C drive. And so in its most basic form, my Excel workbook is 8.14 kilobytes. Okay, nothing major yet. I also like to point out that in the Data Ribbon tab, we can look at the workbook connections. And as we would expect for a blank workbook, there are no connections to any data stores. And now I go ahead on the PowerPivot ribbon and launch the PowerPivot window. So we can see an entirely different window launched here. Take a look that Excel workbook is available from here, and its associated PowerPivot window is open here. Here on the Home ribbon tab, then, is the ability to work with the clipboard, so copy and paste operations. And then here in the Get External Data group, we can load from Microsoft database products, from data feeds, from text files, or if you click on From Other Sources, it just gives you an idea of the rich data sources that are natively supported by PowerPivot. So we see Oracle, Teradata, Sybase, Infomix, DB2, others. Okay, so let me go ahead and select SQL Server. And this is pretty much starting the table import wizard. So it wants to know where your SQL Server instance is, the credentials used to connect to it, and the database you're connecting to. So I'll go to localhost with Windows authentication, and I'm going to import from that very same view in the AdventureWorks DW 2008 R2 database. I always like to provide a friendly name that really is just the name of the database that I'm querying. We're then at this junction that for relational importing, you have the ability to import from the tables and views that you have permission to work with, or you can construct a query, and I'll demonstrate both approaches this afternoon. So introducing from the view that is the fact internet sales demo, we have the ability to provide a friendly name for it, which I'll name simply sales. That will become the name of the table in our model. We can preview and filter, so this is great for just checking that the data is as you'd expect, but it's also used to filter vertically by removing columns that are not of interest, or horizontally by applying filters. For example, we're only interested in dates for the year 2006. Okay, I'm not going to apply any at this stage. We'll bring in everything, click Finish, and here it is loading those 600,000 rows of data. All right, and here it is as our very first table, the sales table within the PowerPivot window. Filtering on a product. I'm not sure if you're going to notice, but that's almost instantaneous. It wasn't quite the case when I was filtering the table in the workbook. If I go ahead and remove that filter and then apply a sort across the 600,000 rows, it's basically instantaneous. The deal is this, that once that data is loaded, it's actually residing in memory. And that's key to this product. All right, once in memory, it's extremely efficient for it to go ahead and to filter, to sort, slice and dice this data. Okay, let's put it to the test by saving. When I save, remember, the metadata of the model, including the data itself, has been saved in the workbook, and we see the size of it is 1.57 megabytes. So let's just do a quick calculation there. 1.57 divided by 21.6. We see here about 7% of the size. Is that significant? All right, so when we're working with large volumes of data, not only is it efficient, but it's going to allow us to work with volumes in excess of what Excel was ever designed to do. And that's really quite key. Okay, so back to the PowerPivot window. That's my very first table, but I didn't intend to bring in everything. To do a fair comparison, I brought the full table in. Here on the Design ribbon tab, I can come back to Table Properties, and I can redesign either using Table Preview, or you can switch to Query Editor and modify the query directly. Here in Table Preview, I'm simply going to remove 2 of these columns. I don't need information for the analysis that I need to do about sales order numbers or line numbers. So the important takeaway here is that you should not introduce data into the model that is not used to query or to support calculations within the model. You're simply taking up space, you're taking up memory for no benefit. So now when I click Save, it redefines the table and reloads the data into the window. Now this is a time to point out an important thing, and that is this data is read-only. So you can hear me trying to update the values in these cells, but it won't work. All right? The only way you can change the data, in this case, is to refresh and take the data in from the data source again. Okay, if it's copy and paste, that obviously doesn't apply. If you need flexibility, that you need to play around with the values in here, I'm going to show you an approach shortly with the linked tables in Excel. And that will allow you to move to Excel and modify the data, and then it synchronizes it into the model. Okay, I need to introduce some more data. So the approach here is you could go ahead and say, let's bring in more data from SQL Server, but that relaunches the table import wizard, and it requires the definition of a new data source. My intention here is to open up an existing connection. And when I open an existing connection, it launches the table import wizard using that connection. That's usually desirable. I don't want multiple definitions to the same data source. I just want to reuse that data source. Okay, so this time what I'm going to do is use a query to introduce product information. So the friendly name for this query that will become the table name will be product. I could, if I know my query writing, write it direct or copy and paste from Management Studio. What you'll discover, though, is for the target audience that are not likely to have those skills to write queries and join tables, is that when I click Design, I get a Query Builder interface. And does this look familiar to anyone? Where did the analysis services team borrow this from? Yeah, this is from Report Builder. So when constructing a relational query, the Report Builder designer gives us this relational query editor. So I come down to product, and I select that I'd like the product key that's required for the relationship. I need the English product name, and I also need to analyze by color. And then I come down to the subcategory, and I introduce the English product subcategory name. And then for category, I bring in the category name. And I can run the query just to verify that it brings back the data that I expect. And then when I click OK, it copies the query here into this SQL statement box. And now I click Finish, and it imports the data. So we now have a second table of 397 rows. I'm going to do that one more time, because I also need customer data. So again with a query. And this time I come to my customer dimension. And we'll see that there's a geography key because there's geographic information that is used to store the addresses of customers, but I need the first name and the last name. And then I can come across to that geography table and introduce the city, state, province name, and English country region name. So we end up with this result set of our customers. And there's the third table, 18,000 customers.
Could you also use just a stored procedure in there?
So the question is, could you use a stored procedure? Yes, you can. So in the SQL statement box, you can go ahead and execute a stored procedure, providing that it returns a single result set. The set no count should not be used as a directive either. Alrighty, well that's convenient because all this data came from one location, one data source. But what we'll see here is that we need to analyze by date, which is a pretty common requirement, right? All that we have here is the actual date value in the sales table. So it just so happens that the date information is available through a data service that's been published on the intranet. Another question.
Yeah, can you use a shared data source that you don't have to give the user information to the database?
Okay, so the question is the concept of a pre-published shared data source? No. No. So what you could do is either grant them permissions or give them a login, username and password, I guess, are the only approaches. They must be defined within the model themselves. So no concept of referencing a predefined data source. Okay. Another question.
From your demo so far, what PowerPivot to do with Excel? I mean, could you just stand alone?
Okay, the question is, what has PowerPivot got to do with Excel? Well, Excel happens to be the tool of choice for most analysts, right? It's become a very, very powerful product beyond just core spreadsheeting capabilities. So it's of interest to note there are numerous add-ins that extend the capabilities of Excel for numerous different purposes. And so it was actually just the best fit for the target audience that are likely to adopt PowerPivot. They're likely to be Excel analysts. All right, what you'll discover is that the expression language that is used here in model development lends and borrows a lot from the Excel function library as well. All right, so it's a natural evolution of what Excel can do to a more powerful space to producing models. All right. So where the demonstration is heading is I need to bring in some date information. I think it's a great practice within your organization that if you're encouraging many users to create models, that you define date consistently in a view or perhaps a feed, and then you encourage all of those model authors to use that feed consistently. That way we have consistent definitions around date. So if I copy the URL here, you'll see that there's one feed called corporate date that is exposed to this data service. Switching back then to the PowerPivot window on the Home ribbon tab, I can then say, let's import data from the data feed. And so I'm simply going to call this the AdventureWorks data service. Click Next. It interrogates the data service and says, sure, there's one feed. There could be multi. We can import this as a table that I'll choose to name date. The preview and filter then allows me to look at the data and filter by column. So for example, I don't need everything. I just need this date column because that will support the relationship to my sales data. I need the month of year label that is here. For other reasons that I'll demonstrate shortly, I need the month of year key. I then have calendar quarter of year, and then the calendar year. And as you can see, not that I require it for this demonstration, but there's fiscal information as well. So here we've got this very rich set of consistently defined date data that's useful for all modeling. Just to preview the applied filters, this link is really helpful to show you what columns will be imported. And if you are filtering by row, which by the way is not possible for feeds, but for relational data, if you're using filters like country is USA, you get to review them here as well. And now when I click Finish, I'm loading data from this data feed. Cool. And that's the fourth table. Now there's one more to go. So to make full sense of the sales information, I also need to analyze by sales territory. And it just so happens that sales territory does not live in the data warehouse. Where does it live? Here in a CSV file, for some reason. Now, there are two choices here. I could use this as a data source and load in from text. Okay, but I need flexibility. I need to modify the data as well. Now, once it's loaded in the PowerPivot window, I cannot delete rows, I cannot insert them, I cannot modify values in the cells. So for the flexibility that I'm after, I'm going to switch across to Excel, and then here in Sheet 1, I'm just going to use the native Excel capabilities to bring data in from text. And there we see, sitting in my demo folder, is the sales regions. When I click Import, I need to define the structure of this file, so it's delimited by comma. And then I'll import this into Sheet A1. And there it is. Now, the way that we import this into PowerPivot is it needs to be a table in Excel. So that's easily fixed by selecting the range, Insert Table, and yes, my table has headers. Okay, you cannot create a table if it's connected to an external data range. So it's saying, if you do this, we're going to break that external connection, which is completely fine. And now I've captured that data in Sheet 1, and it's now represented as a table. My preference is to provide a name for that table that will become the name of the table in the model. So I'll choose to call this region. And then what I can do on the PowerPivot ribbon tab is to create a linked table from this table. And then we see the addition of a fifth table in the model. Note the chain link icon here that represents a linked relationship. And all of the rows and columns have been loaded. We also have this second tab here called Linked Table that supports jumping to that table in Excel, refreshing it. There's an update mode that is automatic. And let me demonstrate what that does. So switching back to Excel, I might decide that NA isn't descriptive enough. Let's call this not applicable. Copy, paste. And also, I'm going to introduce that we have a new country, New Zealand, and a region, New Zealand. Now, when I switch back to the PowerPivot window, that auto update mode simply synchronizes what it finds in that table. So while this data here is not updatable, you can modify it in the Excel workbook and synchronize. So that'll provide enormous flexibility. Okay, last thing I need to do to bring this all together is to create relationships. Now, relationships will be auto-detected and created if you import multiple tables at the same time and there are foreign key relationships between those tables. I didn't do that in this demonstration. All right, each table was imported separately. To manually create relationships, then, you can right-click a column, like date, create a relationship, in this case to the date table and its date column. Now, it is necessary that you have matching data types on both sides. All right, for product key, that's pretty straightforward. Create a relationship to the product table and its product key. And then customer. And finally, sales territory is to region and the key column. And that gets me to step 1. I've loaded integrated data. When I go ahead and save the workbook, let's take a look at the size then. For all of this, we're up to 1.6 megabytes. Still pretty impressive. Okay, and very portable. I could now hand this workbook off to somebody else that has PowerPivot, and they can open this up. All the data and metadata is stored in that single document. All right, so that's loading data. So preparing data, tables then can be renamed, moved, and deleted. Columns can be renamed, copied, and deleted. And then relationships can be established between the tables, as I've just demonstrated. It's also possible to create calculated columns, and I'll demonstrate that later on. And then that brings us to using this model to create reports. So there are 3 approaches in Excel for creating reports off your model. The first is the pivot table. The second is the pivot chart. They're closely related. There's a new experience known as the PowerPivot field list, that when you create a pivot table or chart off a PowerPivot model within the same workbook, there's a new field list that's different from the OLAP field list that you may be familiar with. My favorite topic for producing reports off cubes and PowerPivot models is the freeform approach with the Excel cube functions. All right.
Sorry, could you rewind a bit?
Okay, so the question that has come up is, could I clarify what this PowerPivot field list is? I will in demonstration. Just about to switch to it. So I'm just pointing out here that the Excel add-in provides a different experience to producing pivot tables and pivot charts off PowerPivot models within the same workbook. In fact, here it is here. All right, so the PowerPivot field list differs from the regular field list because, first of all, it has a search box at the very top. So we can search for text values within the model definition. What you see here, then, is different, too, because it's represented as tables and the columns of tables, and then we'll talk about measures shortly. All right, this is different because an OLAP field list will give you measures broken down by measure group, and then KPIs, dimensions, hierarchies. Remember that the model we've constructed here is tabular in design. It consists of tables, columns, and relationships. All right, so we use the PowerPivot field list to design PivotTable and PivotChart reports. We have the search capability. There's these two extra zones for slices vertical and slices horizontal. And the rest is very much familiar to you with the OLAP field list. You also have the ability to create measures, and we'll cover off on that topic later on. And there's also at the very top, not you can see it here, but review messages and notifications will come back. So if, for example, the model has been changed, and then you come back to the Excel workbook, it will tell you that you need to refresh to see the latest definition of that model. And then finally, if you choose fields from two tables that are not related, perhaps because you omitted to create the relationship, it will detect that there should be a relationship and prompt you to automatically detect and create that relationship. So keep in mind here, the target audience isn't an IT professional that knows data structures, knows how to relate data, and so on. There really is a very good support through wizards and this type of feedback to ensure that the user is on track and doing perhaps what is right. Okay, so let's take a look at this in demonstration. Switching back to the PowerPivot window, the way that you can start to create reports here on the Home ribbon tab is you can create a pivot table, pivot chart, or combinations of them here. So to create a pivot table, I'm going to choose the existing worksheet that essentially is just sheet 2A1. So the pivot table is added. Because this is based on a PowerPivot model, then we get the PowerPivot field list. Let me point out to you also that in my data connections, recall there were none to begin with. It's actually at the moment when you open up the PowerPivot window that it creates this connection named the PowerPivot data. All right, if we come to its properties, the first thing I want to point out to you is that this is used by Excel for communication between the workbook and the embedded model. And importantly, and take note, you should not manually edit or delete this. If you do, you'll potentially and likely corrupt the workbook, and it will no longer be able to communicate with the embedded model. Now, when we switch across to definition, what's truly fascinating for those that have a background with analysis services is it is using the OLEDB provider for analysis services in 2008 R2. So the model that is being produced here in the PowerPivot window is an analysis services database that can be queried with this provider. The other thing to point out is the data source, which typically is the instance on the network, is $embedded. I'm going to refer back to this later on because in SharePoint, when we request this workbook and Excel Services interrogates the workbook connections and discovers this type of connection, it knows then to engage the PowerPivot service to then take that embedded model, restore it to an instance of analysis services, and then query it. Okay, so what did I say? Don't change this, but know that this is how it's all coming together. All right, so when you build a pivot table based off a connection that is a PowerPivot model, you will always get the PowerPivot field list. Okay, before I start producing a report, there's more work I think that needs to be done in the model itself. When we look at it, it's table by table. All columns are available. But when you think about the user that will be using this model, does it really make sense that we have product key here? Its purpose was to support relationships between two tables. All right? And also, total product cost might be a bit of a mouthful. I just want that to be called cost. So what I'd suggest before you start writing reports off your model is that you hide columns, potentially hide tables that are not required for modeling, and then rename columns in preparation for a more user-friendly experience. So switching straight back to the PowerPivot window, we can start with the sales table. I can multi-select these key columns, right-click, hide the columns. Now there's a choice here. You can hide from both the PowerPivot window and the pivot table, or from one or the other. Personally, I don't see any good reason that you should be hiding from PowerPivot, because then you may well forget that it's there. All right. Really, the intention is to hide it from those that are consuming the model. So I'm going to hide from the pivot table. Now, you might find it's easier on the Design Ribbon tab here in the Hide and Unhide just to uncheck. So in this column, we're hiding these 4 columns from the pivot table. Then I can come across and rename columns. It's pretty straightforward. Right-click a column, rename. I'm just going to call this Orders. I like to keep these names as concise as possible, so this just becomes Cost, and this one becomes Sales. Moving across to Product, hide and delete. Sorry, hide and unhide. Let's hide the product key. An English product name sort of makes sense from the dimension table point of view to distinguish it from the Spanish and French translations that we have. So for simplicity, I rename this simply to product, this to subcategory, and this one to category. For customer, similar concept, just hide the key. And we'll just name this one state and country. Definitely for date, there's work to be done here. I don't need to expose the date or that month of year key. But for these 3 columns, they make sense from the data feeds purpose, but not from my model purpose. So month, quarter, and year. And then finally for region, I'm happy with country and region. It's just a matter of hiding the key column. Save, and please save frequently. Excel includes the autosave capability, which is on by default, and that's always helpful because for whatever reason, if Excel crashes or blue screen of death appears, next time you launch Excel, you can recover from the last autosave. Autosave will not save PowerPivot. Okay, so you're prompted when you make new data loads or structural changes to the model to save frequently. All right, note the notification we now have in the field list. It knows that the structure of the model has changed and it's prompting me to refresh. And now we get to see a cleaner, more simple interface to the model. Okay, so time to construct a report. It's pretty straightforward. I have a report about sales. The selection of a numeric field automatically places it in the values drop zone. So what's different here is that it's using an aggregate function. By default, it chooses sum, but you can switch to the other 4 of count, min, max, or average. Okay, so by default, sum of sales is good. What it doesn't do, it's a bit of a pain, but this is fixed in the next release, is to format the numbers. So I use value field settings because I like to call this simply sales. And the number format here is just your classic Excel formatting. Next, I can come from the product table and take the category and drop it into the report filter because I'm interested in analyzing, and these are the distinct values found in the category column of the table, just the bike sales. So we have 283 million. Next on the rows, let's introduce subcategory and product. So note the selection of a non-numeric field will automatically place it in the row labels. And now we have this hierarchy concept of subcategory down to product. What I typically like to do here is use the conditional formatting supported in Excel to provide data bars. So note when I apply that formatting to the first cell, you can click on this smart tag, and I want it to apply on all cells that show sales values at product level. So these will be blue regardless of subcategory. And then I like to apply another different colored at the subcategory level. All right, so now we've got relative distribution represented through the data bars. Alrighty, now what is new is the slices vertical and slices horizontal. So slices were introduced as a way of providing visual filters within Excel in 2010. So what I'm going to do is from the region table is place the country and the region in here. So some pretty cool things about these slices. I mean, they're literally begging users to interact with them. For example, I want to know what sales happened exclusively in the United States. And that's the way that I can filter. Pressing the control key, we could have a multi-select of Australia and United States. Or Australia, pressing the shift key to Germany is a range select of the members. Okay, clearing the filters is achieved by clicking top right corner. But what you might note that's interesting is that when you select a member here, not only does the data in the pivot table update, which you'd expect, but this second slicer down here has different shadings. So the heavily shaded represents that there is data at the intersection of United States and these 5 regions. There is no data at the intersection of United States and Australia, as you can see. So it provides this visual feedback through the shadings. Just note when you have a slicer selected here on the options, slicer selected here on the options, you can style them and play around with their sizes and so on. Okay, so these slices can be placed on the vertical. They can also be placed on the horizontal. I'll demonstrate that in the next report. One thing I like to do here is introduce a second instance of sales. So I drag this into the values drop zone. You say, well, why do we want that repeat data? Well, what I can do here is right-click one of these and say, show values as % of parent row total. So this is a way then of expressing, these all add up to 100%. What does this data bar really represent? Road bikes are 51.28%. So that's really a feature of pivot tables, not of PowerPivot, but this is an easy way to produce those common types of calculations like % of, or ranking, or running totals. Okay, so I come in here and I just rename this to % of parent. Save. Okay, let's take a look at a pivot chart. So the other approach is when I select sheet 3, the PowerPivot ribbon tab also supports adding pivot tables and pivot charts. So you can do it from both the PowerPivot window or from within Excel. So I'll add a pivot chart into the existing location. And I know this isn't always encouraged, but I think pie charts are just really easy to demonstrate. All right. Problem with pie charts, of course, is that they can make it very difficult to understand the data that's being represented. But for simplicity, I just want to show you that you can do it. So the pivot chart also uses the PowerPivot field list. I'm going to analyze sales. Let's break it down by product category. And then it's typical to analyze things by time. So here in the date table, I have those 3 fields. So let me bring in year, quarter, and month. So we can see that we have no data for 2009 and above. Note if I select 2005, we only have data for Q3, Q4 that represents these 6 months. Bit of a problem, however, when I look at the months, I would appreciate them being sorted chronologically, not alphabetically. But that's just a fact with this current release, is that it will always sort by the values that it comes up with in the column. So the distinct values found in the column is what you'll see in that order. Okay, we're going to work around that with some calculations shortly. So now I can see in 2008, for quarter 3, specifically in July, we had this portion of sales going to clothing. Favorite topic, freeform reports. Who's worked with these before? Show of hands. Why am I not surprised? About 2 people out of an audience of, let's say, about 60 or 70. These were introduced in Excel 2007. I think they're absolutely brilliant. If you have an analysis services cube and you want to produce a report that is just to your liking or is there to replace a legacy report, you might find it very, very difficult to have a pivot table produce exactly what you want. The fact is that the cube functions allow you to place whatever values and members in any cell that you want, and also to integrate data from multiple cubes and use native Excel functionality to combine them. So there are 7 functions, of which 5 of them are relevant when connecting to a PowerPivot model. They are the cube member, cube value, cube set count, and cube ranked member. I think I can demonstrate all of them. The 2 that aren't relevant are the member property and the KPI, because these are both not supported in the 2008 R2 release. The cube functions require a connection. So the connection will always be PowerPivot data. That is the name of the workbook connection that they will use. So the great thing about freeform reports is that you can extend them with native Excel features like conditional formatting, spark lines, as you see here with a trend, slices, and charts. So far more flexible than a pivot table that is actually quite rigid. You can't insert a column in the middle of a pivot table and add a spark line. Okay, so let me demonstrate a basic report. So I will hide this worksheet. By the way, a pivot chart is always based off a pivot table, so this sheet that I'm hiding is actually the one that supports the chart. Just to make things a little clearer here, this is really my region data. This worksheet here was my sales PT for pivot table. This one here is the sales pivot chart. So this one here will be the sales freeform. Truly freeform. So if I start here in, let's say, cell C3 equals cube, and there's the 7 functions. The IntelliSense have brought them up. Cube member, and the IntelliSense here is brilliant. This is really a list of the workbook connections, of which there's just the one. So to introduce it, I simply press tab. And the second thing is, what's the member expression? So as I start to write the expression, the IntelliSense pops up the structure of my model. So what's very, very cool to notice here is that when we see something like measures, can you appreciate that there is no table named measures in my model? That what it is exposing is an OLAP interface to what is a tabular model. If anything, this should prove the point that the tabular design approach that you take is represented as an OLAP structure. It is tabular in nature, but what this tells us is that other tools that you may be used to, like reporting services, performance point services, can query this as if it's a cube. All right, so what I'm interested in here is from the date, do I call this a table or a dimension? It thinks it's a dimension. Date dot, and it thinks this is an attribute, so it's a quarter. And then it says there's an all member at the top of the hierarchy, and then beneath it are the distinct values, which are members within the hierarchy. You can optionally provide a caption, but if you don't, the member name will become the caption. So what looks like a text value of CYQ1 is really a member, referencing a member in my model. So all I'm going to do is copy this across and manually update that this represents quarter 2, this represents quarter 3, and 4. Over here, I'm going to introduce a set. So using the same workbook connection, I come in again to the date, this time to the year, to the all. And if you know your MDX, you'll appreciate that the children function is going to return all children beneath that member. I'm going to provide a caption that will just be year. So again, while we see the word year here is, appreciate that it's actually referencing a set of members, being all of the years in the model. Now we can test this by using the cube set count function, which cube set B3, there's actually 8 members in there. All right. So to extract an individual member, we have the cube ranked member. So from this workbook connection, from this set B3, let me just lock in 3. That's going to support copy and paste later on. Which rank do I want? Give me... Actually, you know what? Let's change this. I really wanted product. This is going to make the demonstration a little easier. So category all dot. See, we have 4 members, so I just request the children of them. And so I'll call this category. And this time I'll ask for the cube rank member. From here, lock in row 3. Give me the first one. Accessories. Now, to make this a little simpler on you, if I just say, give me the row of A1, the row of A1 will return the row number. So row of A1 is 1. Row of A3 is 3. Row of A55 is 55. Okay, so what's good about this is I can just drag this formula down, and I get 1, 2, and 3. All right. Then, to bring some values in, we have the cube value function. Again, using that PowerPivot data connection, I'm going to request from my measures. So note that each table gets a count measure. That's allowing you to count the number of rows or customers, dates, products, regions, and so on. When we added the sales field into the values drop zone, it created what we call an implicit measure in the background. All right? And by default, it's simply called sum of sales. When I added the second one to get the percent of parent, it added a second measure. So you might sort of frown on this approach. because it might name measures in a way that you don't like. I'll be creating measures explicitly later on, and that would be my suggestion. Do not create them implicitly by adding numeric values down there. Create the measure first with the name that you want, and then introduce it into your pivot table. So for now, I'm just going to put up with the fact that I have sum of sales. So that's the first thing that I'm slicing on. Now, what we need to appreciate is that the model is multidimensional. And that might seem a bit tough because, hold on, we designed this tabular model. But the fact is, when it's hydrated and it's in memory, it really is a multidimensional structure. So I'm asking for a value at the intersection of the sum of sales at the intersection of accessories, in this case, comma, CYQ1. And there's that value. Okay, so what I'm going to do then is lock in and say, well, not C3, I'm going to say C $3 and $B4. That's going to allow me to copy this across and down. And then we get to see the values. And then I can start to use native Excel functionality. I could put a total in here, and just the classic equals the sum of this. Copy this down. And then a total at this level, which you guessed it, is the sum of the above 3. Whoops. Equals. And make this as pretty as you want. So I might choose to format these, right justified, bold, background color of gray, total will be bold, and so on. Again, this is difficult to achieve in a pivot table, but this is now just a free-form report. Also update these columns so they're about 12 wide. And the format number 0 decimal places, comma separated. All right, now it gets a little more interesting. Insert a column here and look for that spark line with a trend. So insert a line based on the range that is the 4 quarters and place it into G4, and then I can copy this down and don't apply formatting. Next, another feature, insert slices. So they're not just supported in PowerPivot pivot tables. You can add slices into any Excel report that you want. They must be based on a connection. So connecting to the PowerPivot data, all of your tables and their columns are potential slices. So let me slice on here. And I'll format that as gray and make it a nice size. And we'll give this report a type, sales analysis. And I could play around with this. It's not doing anything because it's not wired up to my report yet. So we take a look at the slicer settings, and we see here that if it's used in formulas, its name is actually slicer_year1. Year 1, because I already introduced a slicer into the pivot chart report, remember? So there's already a slicer year. This is just the second one. I could provide a better name for it, but year 1 is fine for now. So I can come into my cube value function and say also at the intersection of slicer year 1, and now we're seeing 2007 values. And this is all interactive. Show me 2005, 2006, 2009, and so on. But wait, there's more. So I always like to enhance this with something like a chart. Let's choose 2007. Let's have a look at 2006. In fact, let's filter by nothing. Insert column chart. And now this is based off that same range. So I just move this across. And now when I filter, the chart's in sync. This is really cool stuff. I love it. And the fact is, too, that these cube functions, they don't have to have static references. You can build up strings. So you can take input from other cells. So long as it produces and resolves to a true member within the model, then you can start passing in parameters into cells and then constructing dynamically what it references. Now, the bad side about them, I have to say, is unlike a pivot table where you can come in and it will resize according to the data that is there, the freeform reports won't do that. So, for example, if in 2008 we added a 4th category, you're never going to see it. So it is static in its layout. That is an unfortunate side effect, but that's just the way it happens. One more cool thing to point out about them is it might be difficult for a beginner to construct a report with the cube functions. So you can start with a pivot table, and then on the pivot table tools options ribbon, you can go ahead and convert to formulas. And it will then create or you'll break the pivot table and then create individual cells based on the cube functions. Okay, and this isn't just for PowerPivot. All right, all of these features will work with analysis services cubes you have deployed in your environment. Alrighty, so that's the topic on reports. Let me just go ahead and save just to show you that this workbook has grown marginally, and we're now at about 1.65 megabytes. So model and associated reports. Okay, some questions. So can the freeform reference another workbook? What the freeform reports do, they're using cube functions. They must use a workbook connection that references an analysis services cube. So I could answer your question by saying it could reference another cube. So this is the way of integrating results from multiple cubes, and I could take this value from another cube and divide them within the Excel workbook itself, sure. Was there a second question there? Yes.
You said that the Excel worksheet would contain both the model and the data. Is it possible to remove the data and just save the model?
So the question is it possible, because the workbook consists of the embedded model and data, there's no concept about removing the data and making it useful. What can happen in some situations is that you can point it at a data connection that has no data, for example. How would I word this? If you want a lightweight workbook to deploy to SharePoint, you could do it in such a way that there is, you might be using a view, and you update the view so it returns no rows, and you process from it. And then you remove that where clause in the view, and then you send it to SharePoint as a very small file. And then you configure data refresh on the server, and then it will bring the full data across server side. I'm not sure if that answers your question, but there is no command that allows you to unprocess the content of the PowerPivot model. Okay, so next topic. Enriching the model with calculations is where we get into some advanced territory. So there's an entire expression language known as data analysis expressions. It's designed to deliver easy-to-use constructs that allow extending that PowerPivot model with calculations. And there are two distinctly different types of calculations you need to be aware of. So there are calculated columns that simply add a new column to a table based on an expression. And then there are the measures. And why these are different is that calculated columns are evaluated for each row in the table. Measures are evaluated at query time within the context of the query that's being issued. Now that can be governed by what's on the columns, what's on the rows, what's being filtered, what slice of values are selected. So it's actually when you have to start thinking multidimensionally, when you start defining measures. All right. And this is a problem with the product because up until now it's been very, very good at extracting you from multidimensional concepts. Dimensions, hierarchies, measures, you really haven't been exposed to it. But when it comes to sophisticated measure definitions, you have to start thinking multidimensionally. All right. The PowerPivot model, as I've just said, appears to be tabular, so DAX provides functions that implement relational database concepts. Function libraries consist of many familiar Excel functions as well as additional functions to support relationship navigation in the one-to-many and the many-to-one directions, aggregation across tables, context filtering, as I'll demonstrate for measures, and time intelligence for producing calculations like year-to-date. These are not natively supported in Excel and are largely irrelevant because Excel just doesn't support that multidimensional capability. All right, so calculated columns are the simplest to think of. Row-level context simply means that for each row, it evaluates, computes, and stores the calculation. So that's a big difference. The result of the calculation is stored in the model. So concatenating first name and last name, classic example. Multiply order quantity by unit price. So let's take a look at some of these examples. So in my PowerPivot model, customer is a classic. We have first name, last name. Okay, well, let's create a calculation that equals. So all DAX expressions commence with equals, no different to formula in Excel. But it's easy here. Just select the column, and it inserts the reference to the column. So it's table name, within square brackets, the column name. You can omit the table name if it's within the same table. Then I concatenate a space, and I concatenate the last name. And now for those 18,484 customers, it has stored that full name. So I'll call this simply customer, and that would then prompt me to go ahead and hide first name and last name. Now, this is probably a bad example. It would be more efficient that your source query actually did that calculation, because it's now being forced to store this and this when it probably wasn't necessary. All right, next example is sales. I need to compute profit. So equals sales minus cost. And then I simply rename this to profit. So take a look when I switch across to the Excel workbook and to my pivot table report. It's telling me the model structure has changed, so I refresh. And it seems to be a bit of a bug here. If I refresh at this level, it comes through. And then it's just another field that's available. So selecting it adds it down here using the sum aggregate function. And then I can go ahead and format it. So we'll name this just profit and format this as currency or number, no decimal places. And there's a profit calculation that extends down to the product subcategories and so on. A little more sophisticated, so region here. Let's introduce the fact that I've got tax rates that I need to compute. And the fact is that sales happen in different regions, and therefore different tax rates need to be applied to those sales amounts. So simply by adding a tax rate column here, and I'm going to cheat by using the RAND between functions, so some value between 5 and 10 divided by 100 happens to be the sales rate for these regions. Let me go ahead and copy that range. What was that? Pretty random, is it? I'm going to paste them back as values so they're static and format them as percentages. So as we now appreciate, switching back to the model is it syncs that. We actually have the tax rate here now, and I can format that as a percentage. So this is very, very cool. If you're familiar with this VLOOKUP function, we don't need that anymore. I can come and create a calculated column that says just introduce the related. Because there are relationships already defined between these tables, give me the related from the region table that is the tax rate. As simple as that, and far more efficient. All right, so we see different values here according to the different regions we have. And so now I can extend this calculation by multiplying sales. And let's use a classic Excel function, round, to 2 decimal places. And there's the tax per sales transaction. Rename, tax, switch back. I can now hide this sheet. And refresh. Still not there. I'm not sure why that's not working. And now we can report on tax. Okay, how many seconds did that take? How would that be to achieve in native Excel with VLOOKUP? And how would that perform across the vast volumes of data that we're aggregating here? Okay, so we'll name this tax, format, number, so on. Now, by the way, this formatting is really tedious and really annoying. Great news in the next release is that the formatting properties will be part of the model. So when you introduce them into your pivot tables and other reports, the formatting will simply be consistently applied according to what you've configured once.
So for us who haven't used Excel in the old form, how long this would take? You kind of laughed about how long it would take, but I have no clue. So what would it be, 10 seconds?
So the question is, how long would this take to produce a model like this without PowerPivot? The question is, the answer is probably you couldn't compute it. Because there are certain capabilities that I have here that native Excel wouldn't support. But to bring in feed data and somehow copy and paste that into a sheet and then define a range and then use a VLOOKUP to associate it, it could be done. I couldn't put a time limit on it, but it would be longer than what I'm demonstrating here. Okay, generally speaking, it would be longer because there are many more steps that you need to follow, longer to continue saving, longer to compute these aggregations that we see here in this pivot table. Okay, question down there in the back? Yeah, well, that point was raised earlier. So I think the point that you're making there is that using PowerPivot, we can store large volumes of data. And we had said earlier on the constraint per worksheet is just over 1 million rows. So, of course, the moment you hit that constraint, Excel's not going to help you at all. All right. Yeah, that's it. Yeah, we covered that one up pretty early. Thanks, mate. You're Australian, right? Yes, okay.
When you say large,
Oh, okay, so realistically, how many rows of data could we fit in? Now, your limit, there is a limit with PowerPivot, is that the Excel workbook cannot exceed 2 gigabytes, all right? And so what it comes down to, I've seen examples of over 300 million rows of data. It comes down to the number of columns and the data types and the number of distinct values in those columns, all right? So you could potentially fit billions of rows. That's not out of the question if it's a very simple table with very simple values. Okay. All right, once the workbook is saved, it cannot exceed 2 gigabytes. All right. So let's get into, I've got a couple more questions, and I'm just conscious of time. I have 20 more minutes. Quick.
I was just wondering if there was any means to sort of separate the user's ability to play with the data and then us being able to define the model correctly, like, okay, this relates to this.
Okay, so the question here is about can we separate responsibilities here from model authoring to consumption? Yes, the SharePoint add-in is about this. We publish this to SharePoint. If you don't have SharePoint, then no. If they can open the workbook and they have the PowerPivot add-in installed, then they can get to the PowerPivot model. Okay, that would be a problem. All right, so I'm going to soldier on. Any other questions I'll take up later on. Now, getting into more complex measures is where I need to go. On the PowerPivot ribbon tab here in Excel, we can create measures. To be honest, we have already created some. These are implicit. Give me the sum of the tax column of the sales table. That is a measure simply by adding a numeric field into the values drop zone. By right-clicking a table, we can explicitly define a measure like profitability. Okay, so using an existing, go and give me the sum of profit divided by the sum of sales. So there's two measures being divided by each other. We've now got this profitability metric. Now, I don't know how you would do that without multidimensional space. I don't think you can. See, that has to be evaluated within the context of how it's being filtered over here. So I'll just format that as a %. And now we've got profitability in here. And that just works. If I then say, just show me at Australian level, and the profitability continues to compute according to what is the sum of sales in Australia divided by the profit by the sales.
If you do have SharePoint, does the client Excel spreadsheet need to be added as well?
If you do have SharePoint, and the question is, if you have SharePoint and you're connecting to it from another Excel client, no, because at that point it's just an analysis services cube, all right? So it just needs the OllyDB provider to communicate with the unique connectivity provider and permission. All right, where else could I go here? I'm just short of time. There's so much more I could show you here. One more. New measure. So, I want to know what the contribution of sales is across, that Australia generated across all regions. All right, so sales contribution. So the numerators give me the sum of sales, but the denominator, and this is where we get into new functionality that DAX has. So context modification, in the denominator, I don't want to filter sum of sales by the context that I have in the query. I want to use sum of sales, but I want to ignore any filtering that happens on any field within region. So the all function is a way of saying ignore any filters that are going on over here with country and region. You can use all at table or column level. I'm using the table that says all columns that come from that table will be disregarded. So now what we see is that the contribution of mountain bikes for Australia, let me format that so it's easier to see, is 28%. Okay, if I hide the PowerPivot field list and then show you that for all countries, of course, it's 100%. For France, it's 9%. Think of the speed and think of the sophistication here. Native Excel could not do that. All right. Okay, I would show you year-to-date, but I'm running short on time. So we're at the point where this workbook, it comes in at a size of 2 megabytes. Now the SharePoint side of the story. So we've talked about measures. I've shown you how they can be created in the workbook itself, define it by name, and then use a DAX expression. My demonstrations so far have produced the model, and now we talk about the SharePoint capability. So when you use the SharePoint add-in for PowerPivot, there's a library template that creates the PowerPivot gallery. And I can show you then in demonstration that what it looks like. Well, it looks like this. It uses Silverlight, and what I'm going to need to do is upload my document. So this is just standard library functionality, uploading a document into a library. What is special about the PowerPivot Gallery is that it uses this Silverlight visualization. And what it's doing in the background, and it's taking snapshots of the internal content. This will take maybe 30 seconds, maybe 60 seconds, I'm not sure. But it allows you then to preview what the reports are before you actually request them. Okay, so that's the first benefit of the PowerPivot Gallery, is that you can see what the reports look like. Now, while that's happening, I'm going to switch across to Management Studio and connect to the PowerPivot instance of analysis services. So this is a requirement. When you set up the SharePoint add-in for PowerPivot, there also needs to be an instance of analysis services in a specific mode known as PowerPivot mode. All right? It then works within the SharePoint farm. And as I've mentioned earlier, that the request for a workbook then, when Excel Services notes that you've got an embedded PowerPivot model, it takes that embedded model, which effectively is a backup of an analysis services database, and it restores it across to an instance. When we look at the databases here, you'll then see that that sales analysis database has been added. This management one is of interest because all of the logged information that the add-in is doing is storing in a SQL Server relational database, and it actually exposes this through a PowerPivot workbook that you can then use to query usage information about the PowerPivot system service. All right, so now when I switch back, fingers crossed, if we reload the gallery, yes, there we get to see the preview of our reports. Okay, and there's some pretty cool visualizations here. I'll just show you the carousel so we can spin them around. And then I say I like this, I select it, and then Excel Services goes ahead and produces and returns an HTML representation of that report. And it's fully interactive. What I didn't do, but I'd like to do, is hide the columns, the grid lines, and so on, so it doesn't even look like Excel. It's just like a blank background. You can add images, corporate logos, and so on. Alrighty, so the PowerPivot Gallery has much more functionality. So switching back, we can launch new analytic experiences from here. Let's open up a new Excel workbook or create a report builder report. So effectively what the Excel workbook will do is download an ODC file, an Office Data Connection, that points via the URL to this workbook. And that, by default on the client, providing Excel is installed, will open up Excel with that connection defined, and a pivot table is ready to go. All right, so let's take a look at that. I can now close this workbook. And creating an entirely new workbook, data, connect to analysis services, and then all I need to do is put the path to the workbook. So it's localhost, PowerPivot Gallery, sales analysis.xlsx. Using Windows authentication, that URL is just an analysis services database now. That might take a little while. I'm going to come back to it. Likewise with Report Builder, let me do this one in the background. Add a data source that is to my sales analysis. I'm going to use an embedded connection using analysis services, and the data source equals HTTP, localhost, PowerPivot Gallery, sales analysis.xlsx, using Windows authentication. And then you can see we can test that. It's just going to take a little while for it to warm up. Here it comes back in Excel. It says, well, yes, there is one database there, and there's a model known as Sandbox. That's just the way it's called. And I'm just going to call this sales analysis. But what you'll discover is that when you create a pivot table in this approach, you don't get the PowerPivot field list anymore. That will only happen if the model is embedded in the same workbook. So what it's doing is it's representing the model as an OLAP structure. So every table has a single measure, as we saw earlier. So it thinks every table is a measure group. There's my sales. This is why I'd prefer you create explicit measures and name them appropriately rather than implicitly. And then pretty much your tables are represented as dimensions with the columns as attributes. So you can come in here and analyze sum of sales by country and state, and so on. All right, so this is effectively deployment. Take that workbook, publish it to SharePoint, grant permissions to users. They can connect to it via URL. It's just another database. In reporting services, we can do some really cool stuff. So adding a data set here. So my main data set, the query designer, because it recognizes this is an analysis services cube, it doesn't know any different. We can come in and construct a report from my customers and say, well, go and give me state. Go and give me from my sales the sum of sales. Let's filter this by country, so it's USA only. And then we can also filter by year and quarter.
This is just generating MDX.
It is indeed. So I'm going to point that out to you. Let me just focus on 2007, quarter 1, and expose these as parameters. If I switch across to this mode, you'll see that it has generated MDX. All right. Very cool. So just like to update those fields. We have state and we have sales. Click OK. And then I can do some really cool stuff like visualize this in ways that Excel could never. So inserting a map using the wizard. So I have my map gallery here, provides me the US states. And I'll associate analytic data with those shapes. I have my DS main data set that I've just defined. And the relationship between the shapes is via the state field in my data set. And then I want to visualize the sum of sales using a rule that the lower the sales, the lighter the color. And I get rid of this, get rid of this, get rid of this. And just to polish it off, a nice tooltip. So equals state. So when we hover over any of the shapes, in other words, the states that we have, go ahead and build up a string that puts the state name, put a carriage return line feed, sales, format number, bring in the sales value, 0 decimal places. And here we are producing a reporting services report based off the PowerPivot workbook that has been published to SharePoint. Okay, it's just going to have a think about that for a minute. I will come back to it. The second thing to point out on the PowerPivot gallery is to manage data refresh. So this is all targeted at the business user that created this model and deployed it. Providing they have contribute permissions on this workbook, they can come across, enable the refresh, set up the schedule, email notification should there be a failure to refresh, the credentials that will be used to refresh, and then does this apply to all data sources? Well, no, the data service, that date data is not going to change. I just want this data source here that's the data warehouse data source to be updated. And clicking OK will then enable that data refresh policy. Okay, back to Report Builder. Gee, not much going on quarter 1. What about quarter 2 of 2007? That's better. So hovering over the states, we should get to see the state name and the sales. And of course, you have the full functionality of reporting services. We could use subscriptions to push this data out now to people and so on. And there's the end-to-end story for the business user, self-service BI enabling. The IT story is reasonably short and sweet. And so let me switch back to the slides. There's a management dashboard that then surfaces the logged information that is actually aggregated and stored in the PowerPivot workbook itself. So they use their own technology to help support the monitoring and administration of the service. So there are reports that are embedded into the dashboard that display information about server health, so memory and processor usage, query response times, workbook usage, data refresh status. This access to the dashboard is limited to the administrators of the service application themselves, and this usage data is available in this workbook, and you can go ahead and create your own reports off it should you have permission to access this workbooks. So here's an example of query response times. We can see across dates over here that pretty much everything was running well. We got into this quick range and expected with the green, but nothing to be worried about. Almost 100% of the time, we were getting adequate or trivial response times. In other words, very, very fast responses coming back. There's also the, this is my favorite, the scatter chart here. And so this is an animated chart that allows you to see over time. Each bubble is a workbook. Its size represents the size of the workbook as it may grow with more data. And then its location is represented here on the y-axis with the number of users, and then here on the x-axis by the number of queries. So any workbook that finds itself in the upper right quadrant is becoming heavily utilized. Hovering over one of the bubbles will show you information about it. All right, so how effective do you think that is in helping IT understand the usage of models over time? And at that point, they might say, well, this one is so important, let's go ahead and take that workbook. And what you'll discover in the next release with SQL Server 2012 is a workbook can be restored to Analysis Services Direct or imported into Visual Studio. So an IT professional can go ahead and enhance that with additional features and also overcome the 2 GB limit if they move into that project. Okay. So there's pretty much the demonstrations in publication, scheduling data refresh, monitoring with the dashboard. I should just point that dashboard out to you. Whoops, no. So from central administration, the PowerPivot management dashboard is available from this link. And server health, so there are various reports available here. It's actually using Excel services for these reports. And the reason that I had those animations prepared is that my demonstration isn't enough to provide logging information. There's also a time period that it takes to capture that and then surface that back to administrators. But here in the drop-down list, you get to see the types of reports that are available. So query response times, average CPU and memory utilization, activity and performance. We have an activity list here, data refresh lists here, failures are here. I think IT would be interested to know that workbooks are not updating, potentially a database is offline or relocated to a different instance. And that animated chart would usually go here, but I have some error at this stage. All right, quick word to wrap up on where things are heading. So we can't talk about codename Denali anymore officially. As you appreciate, it's SQL Server 2012. There are big things in store for this approach to producing models. So PowerPivot is just one of 3 supported approaches to producing a data model in analysis services. It is now referred to as a BI semantic model. The 3 approaches are PowerPivot and the tabular project. They are both tabular design approaches. And then you have the multidimensional approach, which is what you've been, may well be familiar with as the unified dimensional model. Regardless of development approach, multidimensional or tabular, they are all BI semantic models. PowerPivot is the approach that analysis services team have said we want to broaden the reach and allow business users to create their own models and then deploy them. So there is a tech ed presentation that's included here, but no doubt a more up-to-date presentation is available this week here at the PARS Summit. Just quickly, some of the new features that extend beyond what I could demonstrate with the 2008 R2 product. So multiple relationships between tables are now supported. Marking date tables will provide benefits to work with non-date keys. Sorting columns by a different value. So remember my months sorted alphabetically? The month key that I included in the date table could be used to sort the months chronologically. The definition of hierarchies. So to have a geography hierarchy from country, state to city can now be defined. Binary columns to include images, which will be useful for what was known as Project Crescent, but now PowerView. So it loves to exploit visualization with images. Distinct count functions for measures, hidden measures, column and measure format properties that will be honored by pivot tables. Key performance indicators, perspectives to narrow down the visibility of larger or complex models, and then reporting properties that will get the most out of reporting applications like PowerView. There's an additional tab, the Advanced tab, that can be turned on to define perspectives and the reporting properties. There's also a diagram view, so you can look at it from a diagram of tables, columns, and relationships rather than just the grid view that we presently have in 2008 R2. The measure grid supports defining measures in the PowerPivot window, which always seemed odd to me that you had to define part of the model, i.e. the measures, by going outside into Excel. So you now have two approaches. The measures and KPIs can be defined in the PowerPivot window or in Excel. And pretty much I wrap up by leaving you with some resources that if you want to explore this further, of course, there are many more sessions here at PASS or on the recordings that are obtainable. Don't forget to fill in one of these. I'm sure you've heard that enough times this week. Thank you very much for your time and attendance. I hope this has been of use.